The day my boss crawled under my desk and whispered, "Act natural, just keep working," I thought he'd finally lost his mind. But then I heard footsteps outside my office door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that didn't belong to anyone on our floor. What I didn't know yet was that the next 20 minutes would expose secrets about our company, my boss, and even my own life that I never saw coming. And by the time it was over, the quiet office job I thought was boring would become the most dangerous place I'd ever worked. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I used to think my job was the safest, most predictable thing in my life. I worked on the fourth floor of a gray office building that looked exactly like every other office building in the city. Nothing special about it. Fluorescent lights, the quiet hum of computers, the smell of burnt coffee that lingered from the break room no matter how many times someone cleaned the machine. Most days were so routine I could predict them down to the minute. My name is Daniel, and at the time I was 32 years old, working as a mid-level data analyst for a logistics company called Hawthorne Freight Solutions. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly spreadsheets, shipment records, and numbers that blurred together after staring at them for 8 hours straight. But the job paid well, and after the chaos I'd gone through earlier in life, boring felt like a blessing. My boss, Mr. Caldwell, was the kind of man people described with the same 3 words every time: quiet, serious, and distant. He'd been with the company for nearly 20 years, and nobody ever saw him laugh, not once. He wore the same type of dark blue suit every day, always perfectly pressed, and he spoke in calm, measured sentences that made you feel like every word had been rehearsed beforehand. But there was something else about him, too, something that made people respect him, maybe even fear him a little. Mr. Caldwell noticed things. If someone submitted a report with one incorrect number buried in 20 pages of data, he would find it. If an employee showed up 2 minutes late 3 days in a row, he'd quietly mention it during their performance review months later. His memory worked like a filing cabinet that never lost a folder. Despite that, he'd always treated me fairly, maybe even better than most employees. He was the one who recommended me for a promotion 6 months after I started. He once stayed late helping me correct a complicated shipment database that I accidentally scrambled. He never said thank you or good job, but you could tell by the way he nodded when something was done right. So I respected him, but I never really knew him. That Tuesday morning started like any other day. I arrived at the office around 8:45, 10 minutes before my shift officially started. The elevators were crowded with the usual mix of tired employees holding travel mugs and checking their phones. By 9:05, I was sitting at my desk, opening the shipment tracking system and preparing to review delivery reports from the previous week. The office was quiet except for keyboard clicks and the faint whirring of printers down the hall. That's when something strange happened. At first, it was just a sound. Footsteps. Fast footsteps coming down the hallway outside our department. I didn't think much of it at the time. Offices always had people rushing around for meetings or deadlines. But then, my office door opened suddenly, and Mr. Caldwell stepped inside. Now, that alone wasn't unusual. He sometimes stopped by to review reports. But the look on his face made my stomach tighten instantly. He looked different. His normally perfect tie was slightly crooked, his hair looked like he'd run his hand through it several times, and his eyes moved quickly around the room like he was checking something. Or someone. "Good morning, sir," I said automatically, turning slightly in my chair. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door behind him and quietly closed it. Then he locked it. That was the first moment I felt a real flicker of confusion. Mr. Caldwell never locked office doors. Before I could ask what was going on, he turned toward me and spoke in a low voice. "Daniel." "Yes?" "I need you to stay calm." The words were strange enough that I half laughed. "Okay." But he didn't smile. In fact, he looked more serious than I'd ever seen him. He continued quietly. "Someone may come into this office in the next few minutes, and when they do, I need you to act exactly the way you were acting before I walked in." I stared at him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. "Sir, what?" He didn't explain. Instead, he walked quickly toward my desk, and then, without warning, my boss got down on his hands and knees. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Mr. Caldwell, the most serious man in the entire company, was crawling across the carpet like he'd dropped something. "Sir," I kept my hand on the doorframe for a moment longer than necessary, buying myself a few seconds to think. Victor Langley stood there with his usual calm expression, but there was something sharper in his eyes today. The two men beside him didn't look like normal auditors. They looked more like investigators, the kind of men who didn't ask questions unless they already suspected the answers. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Mr. Caldwell?" Victor repeated. I forced a small shrug. "I haven't seen him this morning." It wasn't entirely a lie. I hadn't seen him arrive. He had just suddenly appeared in my office minutes earlier like a storm cloud walking through the door. Victor studied my face for a long second. Then he leaned slightly, peering past my shoulder into the office. My desk, my chair, the cabinet beside it. And somewhere underneath that desk, my boss was lying on the floor like a fugitive. I felt sweat forming under my collar. "Mind if we take a quick look around?" Victor asked politely. Every instinct in my body screamed that letting them inside was a terrible idea, but refusing would look even worse. "Sure," I said, stepping aside. "Go ahead." The three men walked in slowly. I returned to my desk, sat down, and forced my hands onto the keyboard like I was working. "Act natural," Caldwell had whispered. "Just keep working." So I opened the shipment report on my monitor and started scrolling through numbers I couldn't focus on. Victor moved around the room casually, glancing at the shelves and filing cabinets. One of the other men walked toward the window and looked outside. The third stood near the door like security. My throat felt dry. The entire time, I was painfully aware that less than 2 feet beneath me, a grown man was hiding. Then Victor walked closer to my desk, too close. He rested one hand lightly on the edge of it. "Busy morning?" he asked. "Normal reports," I replied, trying to sound bored. "End-of-week shipment summaries." He nodded slowly. Then he looked down at the floor beside my desk. For a moment, my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might pass out. But he only bent slightly to examine a power cable running from my computer to the wall. "Messy wiring," he muttered. I forced a small laugh. "Yeah, maintenance said they'd fixed that weeks ago." He straightened again. Under the desk, there was still no sound, no movement. I didn't know how Caldwell was staying so quiet. Victor stepped back and glanced around the office once more. "Strange," he said calmly. "Mr. Caldwell's assistant said he arrived early today." I shrugged again, pretending indifference. "Maybe he's in a meeting?" One of the other men spoke up for the first time. His voice was low and firm. "His calendar is empty this morning." That comment sat in the air like a heavy weight. I kept typing random numbers into a spreadsheet cell just to maintain the illusion of work. The keys sounded too loud in the quiet room. Victor watched me for another moment. Then he gave a small smile. "If you see him," he said, Please let him know corporate compliance would like a word. Compliance. That word made my skin crawl because everyone in the company knew what that meant. Investigations, internal reviews, sometimes even police involvement. Of course, I said. I'll tell him. Victor nodded once more. Then he and the two men turned and walked out of the office. I heard their footsteps fade down the hallway. The moment they disappeared, my entire body sagged with relief. But I didn't move yet. I sat there frozen for nearly 20 seconds, listening carefully. Silence. Finally, I whispered, "They're gone." For a second, nothing happened. Then slowly, Mr. Caldwell slid out from underneath the desk. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and brushed dust off his sleeves like he had just finished tying his shoes rather than hiding from corporate investigators. I stared at him. "You're going to explain that," I said quietly. He walked to the window and peeked through the blinds toward the parking lot below. His expression was tense in a way I had never seen before. After a moment, he turned back toward me. "Daniel," he said, his voice low, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable." I folded my arms. "Try me." He hesitated for a moment. Then he said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Victor Langley isn't here for an audit." I frowned. "Then why is he here?" Caldwell looked directly at me. "Because someone in this company has been moving millions of dollars through fake shipping accounts." I blinked. "What?" "Fraud," he said simply. "Large-scale fraud." My mind raced. "Okay, but what does that have to do with you hiding under my desk?" Caldwell sighed slowly. "Because Victor thinks I'm the one doing it." The words hung in the air. I stared at him in disbelief. "That's ridiculous," I said automatically. "You've worked here 20 years. "Exactly," he replied quietly, "which makes me the perfect scapegoat." A cold chill crept up my spine. "If you're not doing it," I said slowly, "then who is?" Caldwell walked back toward my desk and lowered his voice even further. "That," he said, "is what I've been trying to figure out for the last 3 months." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. "So you're telling me corporate thinks you're stealing millions of dollars and your solution was to hide under my desk?" For the first time since he'd walked in, Caldwell actually looked slightly embarrassed. "Temporary solution," he admitted. Then he looked at me again, more serious than ever. "Daniel, I need your help." My eyebrows lifted. "Your help?" "You work with shipment data every day. The fraud is hidden inside the logistics records. Someone is creating fake delivery routes and phantom clients." My stomach tightened. "You think I've seen something?" "You think," Caldwell said slowly, "you may already have access to the proof." At that moment, the quiet morning I thought I understood suddenly felt like the beginning of something much bigger, something dangerous. And the worst part was, I had a feeling my name was about to get dragged into it whether I wanted to or not. I stared at Mr. Caldwell for a long moment, trying to decide whether this entire situation was insane or whether I had just stepped into something far more serious than I understood. "You think the proof is in my reports?" I asked slowly. Caldwell nodded. "Not just your reports, your access." He pulled a chair closer to my desk and sat down, leaning forward slightly. The calm, quiet man I had known for 2 years was gone. In his place was someone tense, focused, almost desperate. "Daniel," he said quietly, "the fraud is hidden in shipment routing data. Small adjustments, tiny ones, numbers that look normal unless you know what to compare them against." I turned back to my monitor, scrolling through the spreadsheet I had been pretending to review earlier. Rows and rows of shipping routes, delivery dates, warehouse transfers. At first glance, it all looked completely ordinary. If corporate suspects you, I said carefully, why are they checking my office? Caldwell rubbed his forehead for a moment before answering. Because they know I review your department's reports. If someone planted the fraud under my name, they would assume the evidence passed through the analysts I supervise. My stomach tightened slightly. Meaning me. Meaning anyone on the team, he corrected quickly. But you have the most complete access. That didn't make me feel any better. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. Let me make sure I understand this. Corporate thinks you're stealing millions through fake shipments. You think someone else is framing you, and somehow the proof is hiding inside our shipping logs? Caldwell nodded once. Exactly. I looked at the door again instinctively, half expecting Victor Langley to return with security guards. Then why run? I asked. Caldwell's eyes darkened slightly. Because Victor isn't just auditing, he's building a case. Against you? Yes. He paused. And once he decides the evidence is enough, I won't get a chance to defend myself. I studied his face carefully. For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone cornered. So what do you want me to do? I asked. Caldwell leaned toward my keyboard. Pull the shipment records for the last 6 months, specifically anything routed through Warehouse Sector 9. I frowned slightly as I typed into the database filter. Sector 9? Yes. The results began filling the screen. Hundreds of entries, truck IDs, cargo weights, delivery timestamps. Everything looked normal. That's a lot of data, I said. Caldwell pointed to one column. Sort by client account. I clicked the header and the list rearranged itself. Names of companies appeared in alphabetical order. Logistics clients, manufacturing partners, retail distributors. Caldwell scanned the screen carefully. Then he tapped the monitor with his finger. There, he said. I leaned closer. The account name read Meridian Trade Group. What about it? I asked. Caldwell crossed his arms. Look at the shipment frequency. I scrolled through the entries. Meridian appeared again and again, nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. They move a lot of freight, I said. Caldwell shook his head slightly. No. What do you mean? Meridian Trade Group doesn't exist. I blinked. What? He pointed again. It's a shell account. I felt a strange chill run through me. But it's in our client's system. Exactly, Caldwell said quietly. I clicked open the account details. Address fields appeared, billing information, contact email. Everything looked legitimate at first glance. But when I looked closer, something felt off. The phone number had an unusual format. The mailing address listed an office building I didn't recognize. Maybe they're a small client, I said uncertainly. Caldwell leaned closer to the screen. Daniel, look at the shipment weights. I highlighted the column. My eyes moved down the numbers. 500 pounds, 700 pounds, 900 pounds. At first, it seemed random. Then I noticed the pattern. Every shipment ended with the exact same number, 000, 500, 700, 900. Not 512, not 738, always perfect round numbers. That's strange, I murmured. Caldwell nodded. Real shipments almost never land on exact weights. Packaging, pallets, containers, there's always variation. I felt my pulse quicken slightly. You think these are fake shipments? I know they are. I scrolled further down the records. But if they're fake, where are the trucks going? Caldwell pointed to another column. Look at the delivery destinations. I opened the route map attached to the first entry. The shipments supposedly traveled from our main warehouse to a distribution center across the city, but something immediately caught my attention. Wait, I said slowly. That address, I zoomed the map slightly. The address wasn't a warehouse, it was an empty industrial lot. Caldwell nodded grimly. Exactly. A heavy silence filled the room. My brain was starting to piece together what this meant. Someone created a fake client, then logged fake shipments to fake locations. Caldwell nodded again. And every shipment moves money through the system. Billing charges, fuel reimbursements, handling fees. My stomach turned slightly. Millions? I said quietly. Yes, over time. I leaned back in my chair again, suddenly aware of how deep this problem might go. But why frame you? Caldwell looked at the screen thoughtfully. Because I oversee the data validation reports. Whoever did this needed someone senior enough to take the fall. My office suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour ago. So the real question is, I began. Caldwell finished the sentence quietly. Who had the access to create Meridian Trade Group in the first place? I pulled up the account creation log and typed in the search field. The system processed for a second. Then a single result appeared. Account created 3 months ago, authorized by Department Supervisor Clearance. My stomach tightened slowly. Department Supervisor? I said slowly. Caldwell's expression turned serious again. That's my level of authorization. I looked at him. Meaning someone used your credentials. He nodded grimly. Before I could respond, my phone suddenly buzzed on the desk. Both of us froze. I stared at the phone for half a second after answering, trying to steady my voice before speaking. "Hello?" I said. Victor Langley's voice came through the speaker, calm and precise as always. "Daniel, I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Across the desk, Mr. Caldwell stood completely still, watching me carefully. I swallowed. "No, just working on shipment reports." There was a brief pause on the line. "Good," Victor said. "I was hoping you might help me with something." My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "Sure." Caldwell slowly stepped backward toward the wall, trying to stay out of view if someone passed by the glass window in my office door. "We're reviewing a few recent client accounts," Victor continued. "One of them passed through your department's data logs." I already knew what he was about to say. "Meridian Trade Group," he finished. My chest felt tight. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I was just looking at those shipments, actually." Caldwell's eyes sharpened instantly when he heard that. On the other end of the call, Victor spoke again. "Interesting timing." I forced a small laugh. "Coincidence, I guess." There was another pause. The kind of pause that makes you wonder if the other person is reading your thoughts through the phone. Then Victor said something that made my stomach twist. "Daniel, would you mind stepping down to conference room B?" My eyes flicked toward Caldwell immediately. His expression hardened. I hesitated just long enough that Victor noticed. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," I said quickly. "Just in the middle of a report. It won't take long." Caldwell slowly shook his head from across the room, silently telling me not to go. I took a slow breath. "Can it wait 15 minutes?" I asked. Another quiet pause filled the line. "All right," Victor finally said, "but please don't take longer than that." The call ended. I lowered the phone and set it back on the desk. The silence in the office felt heavy. Caldwell stepped closer again. What did he say? "He wants me in conference room B." Caldwell's jaw tightened. Of course he does. I rubbed my temples. "If I refuse, that'll look suspicious." "And if you go," Caldwell said quietly, "he'll start asking questions about Meridian." I glanced back at the computer screen where the shipment records were still open. "Then we need to figure out who created the account before I walk into that room." Caldwell nodded immediately. "Exactly." I reopened the account authorization log and scrolled further down the page. The system recorded every change made to a client account, address edits, billing updates, route adjustments. My eyes scanned the timestamps quickly. Most entries were automated system checks, but one line stood out, a manual update from 2 weeks earlier. Caldwell leaned closer. "Open that." I clicked it. A small detail window appeared. Account modification, shipping route reassignment, authorized by Operations Supervisor Override. Caldwell frowned. "That's not my clearance code." "Then whose is it?" I clicked the authorization ID. The system opened another record. Employee access credentials linked to the override. The name appeared slowly on the screen, and the moment I read it, my stomach dropped. "That can't—" I stared at the phone for half a second after answering, trying to steady my voice before speaking. "Hello?" I said. Victor Langley's voice came through the speaker, calm and precise as always. "Daniel, I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Across the desk, Mr. Caldwell stood completely still, watching me carefully. I swallowed. "No, just working on shipment reports." There was a brief pause on the line. "Good," Victor said. "I was hoping you might help me with something." My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "Sure." Caldwell slowly stepped backward toward the wall, trying to stay out of view if someone passed by the glass window in my office door. "We're reviewing a few recent client accounts," Victor continued. "One of them passed through your department's data logs." I already knew what he was about to say. "Meridian Trade Group," he finished. My chest felt tight. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I was just looking at those shipments, actually." Caldwell's eyes sharpened instantly when he heard that. On the other end of the call, Victor spoke again. "Interesting timing." I forced a small laugh. "Coincidence, I guess." There was another pause. The kind of pause that makes you wonder if the other person is reading your thoughts through the phone. Then Victor said something that made my stomach twist. "Daniel, would you mind stepping down to conference room B?" My eyes flicked toward Caldwell immediately. His expression hardened. I hesitated just long enough that Victor noticed. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," I said quickly. "Just in the middle of a report. It won't take long." Caldwell slowly shook his head from across the room, silently telling me not to go. I took a slow breath. "Can it wait 15 minutes?" I asked. Another quiet pause filled the line. "All right," Victor finally said, "but please don't take longer than that." The call ended. I lowered the phone and set it back on the desk. The silence in the office felt heavy. Caldwell stepped closer again. What did he say? "He wants me in conference room B." Caldwell's jaw tightened. Of course he does. I rubbed my temples. "If I refuse, that'll look suspicious." "And if you go," Caldwell said quietly, "he'll start asking questions about Meridian." I glanced back at the computer screen where the shipment records were still open. "Then we need to figure out who created the account before I walk into that room." Caldwell nodded immediately. "Exactly." I reopened the account authorization log and scrolled further down the page. The system recorded every change made to a client account, address edits, billing updates, route adjustments. My eyes scanned the timestamps quickly. Most entries were automated system checks, but one line stood out, a manual update from 2 weeks earlier. Caldwell leaned closer. "Open that." I clicked it. A small detail window appeared. Account modification, shipping route reassignment, authorized by Operations Supervisor Override. Caldwell frowned. "That's not my clearance code." "Then whose is it?" I clicked the authorization ID. The system opened another record. Employee access credentials linked to the override. The name appeared slowly on the screen, and the moment I read it, my stomach dropped. "That can't be right," I whispered. Caldwell leaned in to read it himself. His face went pale in a way I had never seen before. "Oh no," he murmured. The name on the screen belonged to someone neither of us expected. Victor Langley. The room went completely silent. I stared at Caldwell. Victor authorized the shipment change? Caldwell didn't answer right away. He kept staring at the screen like he hoped the letters might rearrange themselves. Finally, he spoke quietly. "This doesn't make sense." I stared at Caldwell for a long moment, trying to decide if this was bravery or complete madness. "You want me to sit across from the man who might be framing you for millions of dollars," I said quietly, "and just start asking questions?" Caldwell didn't look away. "Not questions," he replied calmly. "Conversation." I rubbed my forehead slowly. "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't," Caldwell said. "Questions make people defensive. Conversation makes them comfortable." I checked the time again. 1 minute left. My chest felt tight, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. "And if he realizes I know something?" I asked. Caldwell's answer came quietly. "Then we improvise." That was not the reassurance I wanted, but there wasn't time to argue. I grabbed my phone, locked the computer screen, and stood up from the desk. Caldwell straightened his jacket again, returning to that composed appearance he always had, but now I could see the tension beneath it. "I'll stay here," he said. "If Victor believes I disappeared from the building, he won't expect me to still be upstairs." I nodded slowly. "And if security comes?" Caldwell gave a faint smile. "Then I'll find another desk to crawl under." I couldn't help letting out a quick, nervous laugh. Then I took a breath and walked toward the office door. My hand paused on the handle. "Daniel," Caldwell said behind me. I looked back. "Be careful what you reveal," he said quietly. "Let him think he's still in control." I nodded once. Then I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The 4th floor felt strangely normal. Employees were walking past with coffee cups, someone laughed near the copy machine, a printer hummed somewhere down the corridor. It was surreal knowing that somewhere in the same building, a fraud investigation involving millions of dollars was unfolding while everyone else carried on with their routine day. I headed toward the elevator. Each step felt heavier than the last. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 2nd floor. The ride down lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt longer. My mind kept replaying the database screen in Caldwell's office. Victor Langley's name attached to that authorization log. If it was real, then the man I was about to meet might already suspect something was wrong. The elevator doors opened. I stepped into the hallway outside the conference rooms. Conference room B was near the end of the corridor. Its frosted glass walls made it impossible to see clearly inside, but I could make out 3 figures sitting at the table: Victor and the same 2 men who had searched my office earlier. I took a slow breath and walked forward. When I opened the door, all 3 of them looked up at once. Victor smiled politely. "Daniel," he said. "Thank you for coming." I nodded and stepped inside. The air felt colder than the rest of the building. The air conditioner was humming softly above us. Victor gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." I sat down, trying to keep my movements relaxed. The 2 men beside him watched me carefully but said nothing. Victor folded his hands on the table. "I understand you were reviewing Meridian Trade Group shipments this morning." I nodded. "Yes." "Perfect," he said calmly. "That's exactly what we wanted to discuss." He slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I opened it slowly. Inside were printed copies of the same shipment records Caldwell and I had just examined upstairs. "Our audit team flagged these deliveries," Victor continued. "They appear unusual." I glanced at the pages, pretending to review them. "In what way?" Victor leaned back slightly in his chair. "The routing patterns don't align with the client's normal logistic profile." That was a very polite way of saying the shipments were fake. I kept my expression neutral. "Maybe the client changed their distribution strategy," I suggested. Victor smiled faintly. "Possible. One of the other men spoke for the first time, but unlikely. The room went quiet again. Victor tapped one finger lightly against the table. "Daniel," he said, "you work closely with Mr. Caldwell, correct?" I felt the trap in the question immediately. "He supervises our department," I replied carefully. Victor nodded slowly. "Has he mentioned anything unusual about these shipments?" My mind raced. Caldwell had warned me not to reveal too much. "Not specifically," I said. Victor studied my face carefully, like he was measuring every word. Then he leaned forward slightly. He said calmly, "Let me be direct. We believe these shipments may be part of a fraudulent billing operation." I nodded slowly, as if this was new information. "That's serious." "Very," Victor said. "And unfortunately, the authorization trail leads to Mr. Caldwell's credentials." I lowered my eyes to the documents again, pretending to think. "Could someone else have used his login?" Victor tilted his head slightly. "That would require access to a secure supervisor terminal." I shrugged. "Maybe someone borrowed his workstation." Victor's smile faded just a little. "Mr. Caldwell is very careful with security." I looked back up at him. "Then maybe the system logs could tell us where the authorization happened." The moment my words left my mouth, Victor's eyes flickered for the briefest second. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did, because for just a fraction of a moment, he looked surprised. He covered it quickly with another calm smile. "Yes," he said, "we're reviewing those logs as well." I nodded slowly. Inside my chest, my pulse was racing. He didn't expect me to mention the logs. That meant Caldwell was right. Victor thought he controlled the investigation completely. "Actually," I added casually, "I saw something interesting earlier." Victor's fingers stopped tapping the table. "Oh?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. The authorization record looked unusual. The room became very quiet. Victor's voice was softer now. "Unusual how?" I looked directly at him. It listed an executive audit workstation. For the first time since I entered the room, Victor Langley stopped smiling. Victor Langley's smile faded slowly, like someone lowering a curtain over a window. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The two men beside him shifted slightly in their chairs, glancing between us. I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse was pounding so loudly in my ears I could barely hear the hum of the air conditioner. Victor folded his hands together again on the table. "An executive audit workstation," he repeated calmly. "Yes," I nodded as if it were just a minor observation. That surprised me too. The silence that followed was heavy. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me more carefully now. "Daniel," he said slowly, "most employees wouldn't have access to that level of system detail." I shrugged lightly. I was curious. Analysts tend to be. One of the men beside him spoke quietly. "What exactly did you see?" I opened the folder again and flipped through the printed records, pretending to search. "Just the authorization log," I said. "It showed the route change came from an audit terminal." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you check the login credentials attached to that entry?" I looked up at him. "Should I have?" He held my gaze for a long second. Then, very slowly, his calm expression returned. "Probably not necessary," he said. That was the first moment I knew Caldwell had been right. Victor didn't want anyone looking too closely at those logs. I leaned back in my chair, letting a thoughtful look cross my face. "Strange, though," I added. "Auditors usually review data, not edit shipment routes." The room felt colder now. Victor tapped the folder lightly with one finger. "Sometimes investigations require temporary adjustments." "Temporary adjustments to fake deliveries?" I asked. The two men beside him glanced at each other. Victor's eyes hardened slightly. "You seem very certain these shipments are fake." I shrugged again. The weights are perfectly round numbers. The destination is an empty industrial lot. It doesn't exactly scream legitimate logistics. For the first time, one of the other men spoke more firmly. Those conclusions are premature. I turned my attention to him. Maybe, but that's what the data suggests. Victor raised one hand gently, signaling his colleague to stay quiet. Then he leaned forward across the table. His voice dropped slightly. "Daniel, tell me something honestly." My stomach tightened. "Okay. Did Mr. Caldwell ask you to review these records?" There it was, the trap laid out plainly now. I kept my breathing steady. "No," I replied calmly. Victor watched my face carefully. "So you started investigating Meridian Trade Group on your own?" "Investigating is a strong word," I said. "I was just reviewing shipment data like I always do." Victor's eyes stayed locked on mine for several seconds. Then he leaned back again and sighed softly. "Curiosity can be dangerous in situations like this." I nodded slowly. Fraud investigations usually are. The tension in the room was thick now. Victor reached into the folder and pulled out another document. He slid it across the table toward me. "Perhaps you should see this." I glanced down at the page. It was a printed system authorization report. At the top was a familiar name, Mr. Harold Caldwell. My chest tightened slightly. The report showed Caldwell's supervisor credentials linked to the original creation of the Meridian Trade Group account. Victor tapped the paper lightly. "This is what we're dealing with," he said calmly. "The account was created using Mr. Caldwell's clearance." I studied the document carefully. "But the later route modification came from the audit terminal," I pointed out. Victor nodded slowly, "which suggests someone may have been reviewing the account recently." His tone made it clear he was trying to redirect the narrative. I looked up at him again. "Or someone was updating it." Victor's smile returned, but it was thinner now. "Possibly." One of the men beside him leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, did Mr. Caldwell behave unusually today?" My mind flashed back to Caldwell crawling under my desk that morning. I kept my face calm. "Not that I noticed." Victor tilted his head slightly. "You're sure?" "Yes." He studied me again. "You didn't see him at all this morning?" I shook my head. "No." That part technically had been true when he first asked earlier. Victor seemed to consider this quietly. Then he said something unexpected. "Daniel, would you be willing to show us the workstation where you accessed the shipment records earlier?" My chest tightened instantly. Caldwell was still upstairs in my office. If we walked in together, Victor would see him immediately. I forced myself to remain calm. "Sure," I said slowly. Victor stood up from his chair. The two men beside him stood as well. "Good," he said. "Let's take a look." My mind was racing now. Every second counted. If I brought them upstairs, Caldwell would be trapped, but refusing would immediately make Victor suspicious. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Right this way," I said. We walked out of the conference room together. As we moved down the hallway toward the elevator, Victor walked beside me while the other two followed behind. "Daniel," Victor said quietly, "you seem like a smart man." I glanced at him. I try to be. "Then you understand that cooperating with an investigation is usually the safest path." The words carried a subtle warning. I nodded. "Of course." The elevator doors opened and we stepped inside. My heart was pounding now. When the doors closed, the small metal box suddenly felt very tight. Victor watched the floor numbers climb slowly. "People sometimes make mistakes when they panic, but honesty tends to work out better in the long run." I looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. "I agree." The fourth floor light lit. The doors opened. My office was just down the corridor. I walked ahead, trying not to rush, but also hoping Caldwell had already found somewhere else to hide. When we reached the door, my hand paused briefly on the handle. Victor noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked. I shook my head quickly. "No." Then I opened the door. The office looked exactly as I had left it. My desk, my computer, the shipment records still open on the screen. But Caldwell was gone. For a split second, relief flooded through me. Victor stepped inside slowly, scanning the room. The two investigators followed him. He walked toward my desk and looked at the monitor. "These are the records you were reviewing?" I said. "Yes." He leaned closer to the screen. Then he said something that made my stomach drop again. "Interesting." I forced my voice steady. "What?" Victor pointed to the system log window open on the computer. The audit log Caldwell and I had used earlier was still visible, and right there, highlighted on the screen, was the entry showing the executive audit workstation login. Victor Langley's login. Victor stared at the screen silently for several seconds. Then he slowly turned toward me, and this time he wasn't smiling at all. Victor Langley stared at the computer screen for several long seconds. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above us. His name was right there in the system log, attached to the authorization entry. There was no way to pretend it didn't exist. Slowly, he straightened and turned toward me. His expression was completely different now. The polite, composed auditor was gone. What remained was a man whose mind was racing behind very still eyes. "Daniel," he said quietly, "why were you reviewing internal audit logs?" I swallowed and kept my voice steady. "Like I said earlier, curiosity." One of the men behind him stepped closer to the desk, looking at the screen. His eyebrows lifted slightly when he read the authorization line. Victor noticed that reaction immediately. For a moment, I thought he might try to explain it away, but instead, something far more interesting happened. He closed the laptop lid halfway, covering the log from view. "System data can be misleading when taken out of context," he said calmly. The other investigator frowned slightly. "Victor, the entry shows your—" Victor raised a hand without looking at him. The man fell silent. Then Victor turned back to me. His voice was lower now. "Daniel, how long were you examining these logs?" My mind moved carefully through the conversation Caldwell and I had rehearsed in those few tense minutes upstairs. "About 10 minutes, I replied. "Why?" Victor studied my face again. "Did anyone assist you?" There it was again, the question circling closer to Caldwell. "No," I said. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. The silence stretched longer this time. Finally, he nodded once, slowly. "Very well." He turned to the two investigators behind him. "It appears Mr. Daniel has simply wandered into a section of the system he doesn't fully understand." One of the men didn't look convinced. "But the authorization log," Victor spoke more firmly this time, "is part of the audit process." The man hesitated, clearly unsure whether to challenge him further. I stood quietly beside the desk, letting Victor control the conversation for now. Caldwell had said something earlier that kept echoing in my mind. If Victor thinks he's still in control, he'll be careless. Victor looked back at me. "Daniel, why don't you step out into the hallway for a moment while we review these files?" My chest tightened slightly. "Sure," I said. I walked toward the door slowly. Just before stepping out, I glanced back once. Victor was already typing rapidly on the keyboard, likely trying to erase or modify the log entry. The door closed behind me. The hallway outside felt strangely bright after the tension inside the office. I leaned lightly against the wall, pretending to check my phone while listening carefully through the door. Muffled voices came from inside. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught fragments. Authorization trail, system misinterpretation, investigation protocol. Victor was trying to regain control of the narrative. Then suddenly the office door opened again. Victor stepped out alone. The two investigators remained inside, reviewing the computer. He closed the door behind him and faced me in the hallway. His polite smile had returned, but it looked forced now. "Daniel," he said quietly, "walk with me." My stomach tightened again, but I nodded. We started down the corridor toward the elevators. Victor kept his hands in his pockets as we walked. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that made the air feel colder. "You seem like a very intelligent employee." I gave a small shrug. "I do my job." "Yes," he said thoughtfully. "You do." We reached the window at the end of the hall that overlooked the parking lot. Victor stopped there and looked down at the cars below. "You know," he continued calmly, "fraud investigations can be complicated." I waited quietly. "Sometimes innocent people get caught in the middle, employees who don't fully understand what they've discovered." I crossed my arms slightly. "What are you saying?" Victor turned to face me directly. The calm tone in his voice remained, but the meaning underneath it was suddenly very clear. "I'm saying that information can be dangerous when interpreted incorrectly." My pulse quickened. "That sounds like a warning." Victor tilted his head slightly. "Advice." For a moment, we simply stood there in silence. Then I decided to take a risk. "The log shows your credentials, Victor." He didn't react outwardly. "Credentials can be spoofed." "From an executive audit workstation?" I asked. Victor's eyes hardened just slightly. "Systems are more vulnerable than people realize." I studied him carefully. "So you're saying someone framed you too?" Victor smiled faintly. "Isn't that what Mr. Caldwell would claim?" Hearing Caldwell's name spoken so casually made my chest tighten. "Maybe," I said, "but I haven't seen his name attached to that log." Victor looked back out the window again. For a moment, he seemed almost tired. Then he spoke very quietly. "Daniel, let me ask you something honestly." "Go ahead." "If you had discovered evidence that could destroy someone's career, would you rush to show it to everyone?" I thought carefully before answering. "If the evidence was real, yes." Victor nodded slowly. "Admirable." He turned back to me. The faint smile was gone now. "But naive." My stomach twisted again. "Why?" Victor stepped a little closer. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because the person you expose may not be the only one involved." The words hung in the air between us. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Victor's eyes held mine for a long second. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Meridian Trade Group isn't just one person's operation." My mind raced. "How many people are involved?" Victor gave a soft, humorless laugh. "More than you'd want to accuse without proof." At that moment, the office door behind us opened again. One of the investigators stepped into the hallway. "Victor," he called. Victor turned his head slightly. "Yes?" The investigator looked uncertain. "You should see this." Victor glanced back at me once more. For the first time since this conversation started, he looked genuinely concerned. Then he walked back toward the office. I followed a few steps behind. When we entered the room, the second investigator was staring at the computer screen with wide eyes. "The authorization record, someone accessed it remotely just now." My chest tightened instantly. "Caldwell." Victor leaned toward the screen quickly. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Then his expression darkened in a way I had never seen before, because the updated log entry no longer just showed Victor's credentials. It now revealed the full network source of the login, and the location wasn't the audit department. It was coming from somewhere else inside the building, somewhere very specific. Victor read the line silently. Then he whispered one word under his breath. "Impossible." I leaned closer to see the screen. The system had traced the remote access terminal location, 4th floor, Executive Management Office. And suddenly, I realized exactly where Caldwell had gone. The room fell completely silent as the new system log entry blinked on the screen. Victor stared at it as if the words themselves had betrayed him. 4th floor, Executive Management Office. My heart began pounding again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was realization. Caldwell hadn't run, he hadn't hidden, he had gone somewhere far more dangerous. Victor's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he pulled his hands away slowly. One of the investigators looked at him. "Victor, what's in the Executive Management Office?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward me briefly, then back to the screen. "That terminal shouldn't be active," he muttered. The other investigator frowned, "But the system says someone just logged in." Victor suddenly stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "We're going upstairs," he said sharply. My chest tightened again as we all moved toward the hallway. The elevator ride back to the 4th floor felt different this time. The tension was no longer quiet and controlled. It was sharp, nervous energy. Victor kept his eyes fixed on the glowing numbers above the elevator doors. When the doors opened, he stepped out first, moving quickly down the corridor toward the executive offices at the far end of the floor. Those offices belonged to the company's senior leadership, the CEO, the chief operations officer, and a few high-level administrators. I had only been down that hallway once during orientation. As we approached, I saw something strange. One of the executive office doors was slightly open. Victor slowed his pace. Then he pushed the door the rest of the way open. Inside, Mr. Caldwell stood calmly behind the large mahogany desk. A laptop was open in front of him, connected to the executive terminal. He looked up at us with the same composed expression he always had at work. "Good," Caldwell said quietly. "You're all here." The investigators stepped into the room, clearly confused. Victor, however, looked furious. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Caldwell didn't react to the anger in Victor's voice. Instead, he turned the laptop slightly so everyone in the room could see the screen. "Finishing the investigation," he said calmly. My eyes moved to the display. It wasn't just the Meridian shipment logs anymore. Caldwell had opened a full network activity report. Hundreds of entries filled the screen, each showing system access points connected to the fake shipping account. Victor stepped closer to the desk. "You don't have authorization to access this office," he said sharply. Caldwell finally looked directly at him. "Actually, I do." He tapped the keyboard once. A document opened on the screen. It was an internal security authorization memo signed by the company's chief operations officer. Emergency access approval issued 3 months ago for Harold Caldwell. One of the investigators leaned forward to read it. "Why would they give you this?" Caldwell answered quietly. "Because 3 months ago, I reported irregularities in the logistics system." My chest tightened slightly. Caldwell had been investigating the fraud long before today. Victor's expression hardened. "You're lying." Caldwell shook his head slightly. "No, I was asked to monitor the system quietly until we could identify the source." He paused. "Which I believe we've done." One of the investigators looked between the two men. "Victor, is this true?" Victor didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Caldwell. "You manipulated the logs," Victor said. Caldwell's voice remained calm. "No, I documented them." He tapped another key. A new window opened, showing a timeline of system access, every modification to the Meridian account, every shipment adjustment, every billing update, and beside nearly every entry, Victor Langley's credentials. The room felt heavy with silence again. One of the investigators exhaled slowly. "Victor, these entries go back months." Victor stepped back slightly from the desk. "Credentials can be stolen," he said quickly. Caldwell nodded once. "Yes, they can." He clicked another file. This time, a video recording appeared on the screen. It showed a small security camera view of the audit workstation room. The timestamp matched the route modification from 2 weeks earlier, and in the video, Victor Langley was clearly visible sitting at the terminal. The investigator closest to the screen went very still. "That's pretty clear." Victor's face had gone pale. He looked around the room, searching for some explanation that wasn't there. Caldwell closed the laptop slowly. The Meridian account moved over $6 million through fraudulent shipment billing, each transfer routed through temporary shell vendors before disappearing offshore. One of the investigators looked at Victor again. "Why?" Victor didn't answer first. Then he let out a quiet breath and laughed bitterly. "Because the system made it easy. Everyone trusts the auditors." No one spoke for a moment. Then Caldwell said something that surprised me. "You could have stopped." Victor looked up sharply. "After the first million," he said with a dark smile. "Or the second?" Caldwell's voice remained calm but firm. "Before you tried to frame someone else." Victor's expression twisted slightly. "You were the perfect target," he admitted. Careful, quiet, nobody would question it. One of the investigators stepped forward and placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. "I think this conversation is over." Victor didn't resist as they escorted him toward the door, but just before leaving the room, he glanced back at Caldwell and then at me. "Curiosity really is dangerous," he said softly. Then he was gone. The room fell quiet again. Caldwell sat down slowly in the executive chair, looking far more tired than I had ever seen him. I stepped closer to the desk. "You planned all this?" I asked. He shook his head slightly. "Not exactly like this." "Then why hide under my desk this morning?" Caldwell allowed himself the smallest smile. "Because Victor arrived earlier than expected, and I needed time to confirm the final log entries." I laughed softly despite everything that had happened. That might be the strangest start to a workday I'll ever have. Caldwell stood and straightened his jacket again. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you handled it well." I shrugged slightly. "I was mostly terrified." He replied, "Courage often looks like that." A few minutes later, the investigators returned, confirming that security had taken Victor into custody and corporate leadership had been notified. The Meridian account was already being frozen. As the room emptied again, Caldwell and I walked back down the hallway toward my office, the same office where the morning had started with confusion and whispered warnings. When we reached the door, Caldwell paused. "Daniel," he said. "Yes?" "Sometimes the quietest places hide the biggest problems." I nodded slowly. "And sometimes curiosity is the only thing that uncovers them." He gave a small approving nod before walking away down the corridor. I sat back down at my desk and looked at the computer screen again. The shipment reports were still there, the same numbers I'd seen every day for 2 years, but they didn't look ordinary anymore, because that